I am Gwen Calvetti, and I'm happy to be here this morning. I would probably rather be out on this gorgeous morning, looking at the skies to see what's coming through, because as I'll show you in a little bit, this is supposed to be a huge migration night. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can find that sort of thing out. I'm the secretary of the Coulee Region Audubon Society and the newsletter editor. I have been for way too long. If anybody is interested, please join us. The third Wednesday of every month at the Nature Place down by Myrick Park, right by the marsh. I have been an avid birder basically my whole adult life. I started looking at birds and keeping track of them when I was quite young. My claim to fame at my local library where I grew up was that between third and fourth grade, you couldn't go to the school library, so I would go to the library in town and ride my bike. And I checked out every single book in the library in the part about birds to read. And then I ran out and I took the bus to the Minneapolis Public Library downtown. And my parents would say, okay, maybe what you should tell people you want to be when you grow up is an ornithologist. And so I would go around saying that, this little 10-year-old, what do you want to be when you grow up? An ornithologist. What's that? That didn't happen. I went to a different gist. I was a speech and language pathologist. I retired from the La Crosse School District in 2011. So I've had more time for birding. I've also been involved in some projects through the DNR for field work. One of them is kind of secret, and the other one was a 5-year project where they do a breeding bird atlas. And I would go out weekly for 5 years to the Coulee State Forest, experimental forest by Bangor, and try and gather evidence of what birds were breeding there. It was pretty fun, and I got to know the forest pretty well and see the changes that happened there over 5 years. There was one year I came, and it's like they had clear-cut a whole area. And there was a really cool bird I was trying to document in that area. And I was like, oh no, but we did document it. So that's a little bit about me and my birding background. Now we'll get to the business of migration, which is going on right now. Now there are basically 2 types of migrating birds. The ones that we all think of are the neotropical migrants. Those are our songbirds that we look forward to in the spring. And they travel far, far distances. They come up here because the food sources and the habitat are what they need to raise their young. And when the kids are done, it's time to go back down south, like a lot of us probably ourselves like to do. And so they can travel huge, huge distances. Some of them are more short-term migrants. Like, how many of you have seen robins here in the winter? Yeah, if there's water and if there's dried berries like hackberries or crab apples or something like that, they'll stick around. We get them every year on the Christmas bird count. But a lot of them will leave. It's just the hardier ones that want to conserve their energy and be the first males to be here to get the girls when they come back. So those are our short-term migrants. Any of you who go south for the winter, we've been going down to Mississippi and Alabama the last few years for a few weeks. And I'll see a lot of the birds that I'm looking for in the summer and the spring down there, loons, who look nothing like we're used to seeing them up north at our cabin, but they're there. The shorebirds, they're hard enough to distinguish in their breeding plumage. I'll see them down there, and I know my husband can attest to this. I'll be sitting there, I'm just not sure which one that is. Is it spotted? Is it a solitary? And he'll go off and leave me to myself. So those are the more short-term ones. And we see We see a lot of them down there when we're there in like February and early March. So those are the two types of migrating birds that you've got. New shoes. Okay, we are really lucky where we live if we're interested in birds and the birds coming through. There are 4 flyways in North America, and we're right along the Mississippi Flyway, which is obvious why it's called that. But it covers a lot of different states, basically anything that, any of the tributaries of the Mississippi kind of follow along it. So you've got Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Ohio, Oklahoma, Michigan, Missouri, Mississippi, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin, and most of the provinces in Canada. So these birds follow basically the river routes to go wherever it is they want to go. And they're showing both the southbound and then northbound. You can see they do, some of them do different things. They go down this way, but they come back through the Caribbean islands and then head back up. So, and the number of birds in the Mississippi that use our flyway is pretty cool too. Oop, jumped. I didn't have my granddaughter to help me set this up. Basically, half of all the migratory birds in North America use our flyway. And that you can see is those are actually geese. They're not the swans. But we all know about the swans over in Brownsville. That's probably our most amazing of the spectacles that are out there, is to go see those swans, the tundra swans coming through. My husband and I just returned from a trip to Iceland, and there we were seeing lots and lots of swans everywhere. And I'm thinking, oh, this is where they are during the winter or during the summer. Well, it isn't. Those were whooper swans, and they looked even bigger than, I would say, than our trumpeters that you sometimes see on the marsh, which are pretty big. But literally everywhere we looked, they were around. And they don't breed there, I guess, but it's migration for them, and they stop over there on their way to wherever it is they go. I think Africa, I read. Okay, ever since people have noticed birds, they've wondered, where the heck do they go? You know, where are robins now? What do they just disappear? Why? And some of the theories that were out there, they sound really funny now, but at the time, they probably made some sense. One theory was that they fly to the moon. And this is something that I got, a couple ducks in the back of Veterans Park one evening. You can see why they might think that. I mean, we've all seen pictures that people have taken where you can see birds silhouetted against the moon. Sure, they're going to the moon. Why not? Probably because there's not enough air there for them. There were thoughts that they hibernate like bears and some of the mammals. You know, they go inside a tree or behind a rock or wherever it's convenient, and they go to sleep for 6 months. You know, kind of makes sense, I guess, especially based on what they did know about other animals and their behaviors. Aristotle, none less than Aristotle, thought that, well, actually they kind of do like a Calvin and Hobbes thing. They transmogrify into something else. They become, there was a bird called a redwing, and he figured they just turned into European robins during the winter. You know, they looked similar, but they morphed into something else. Now, I never found any information that said why he thought that would be the case. But I guess, again, looking at what you saw and knew and understood about the natural world makes as much sense as anything. So, yeah, that was, this was one of my favorites simply because I'm also a storyteller and I do a story that's somewhat similar. Hummingbirds, they're so little. How could they possibly go anywhere? Well, of course, they sat on the back of geese and let geese take them, which actually, when you think about it, would be kind of smart on the part of the hummingbird, but that's not what they do. We all know that now. But I thought that one was kind of fun. Okay, we also have a phenomenon of far north birds that migrate here. This is south for them. Has anybody seen any dark-eyed juncos yet? I'm seeing reports like somebody in Madison about a week ago was getting juncos at their feeder, the little snowbirds. Some people call them snowbirds, little gray ones with a white belly. I haven't seen any yet, but they're coming. And a few years back, I was at a conference in St. John's, Newfoundland, and it was like late July, early August. And we were staying in a dorm, and I walked out, and there's all these juncos. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're early, they're early. No, that's their territory in the summer. So they come. They're pretty regular visitors. We look forward to some winter finches like redpolls. They'll come some years. Used to be that evening grosbeaks would come through. Now I think if you want to see one of those, you got to go way north. They do show up reliably there, but they move from the far north down to about here. They're seed-eating birds, and if there's enough natural sources or feeders out, they'll go that far, and they don't want to waste energy traveling any further than they have to. So those, and then there's always the owls. Winter is kind of owl fever time. We've had snowy owls, long-eared owls, northern saw-whet owls, great gray owls even. Those are far northern birds. Most of them are pretty reliable in places like northern Minnesota. Has anybody here read or seen the movie The Big Year? Okay, well, if you have, in the very beginning of the movie, the three contestants, it's a true story about three men who are trying to get the most bird sightings in North America in a single year. And it was a real competition. With Steve Martin, Owen Wilson, and Jack Black played the three men. It's a great movie. And at the very beginning, in January, they're all up in the Saxon Bog in northern Minnesota because that's where great gray owls can be found. They actually do breed up there as well, but they're harder to see during the summer when they're more secretive. But yeah, you get owl fever. Snowy owls are a favorite. One year on the Christmas bird count, my count area is French Island. And at the time, Fred Lesher, did anybody here know Fred? Yeah, Fred Lesher and Kurt Brunell and I had that territory. And we kept going back to the airport because one of the things with a Christmas bird count is you have to count birds that you can see at the same time to make sure that it's not the same bird moving around. And so we kept going back there. We were so excited. We got 8 snowy owls at the airport that year. They like coming to places like airports or big open fields because it's like the Arctic tundra that they're used to. So that creates a lot of excitement and sometimes issues in the birding world because everybody wants to go see them and it stresses the birds. So people wonder, where do these birds go? I'm just, some of these pictures I just put up there because they're more interesting to look at than me. Um, the hummingbirds have an amazing migration when you think about their size. They'll migrate down the ruby throats, which are the only ones that normally occur east of the Mississippi, the ones that we all get at our feeders. They'll fly down, they'll cut across near the Gulf of Mexico, and they will fly literally nonstop over the whole entire Gulf of Mexico to the usually the eastern Lake Yucatan and places like that in Mexico. And I'm not sure what the actual mileage is across the Gulf, but it's a long way for a bird this big that flaps its wings like hundreds of times a minute. It's just incredible to think of. And that's part of the reason any of you who have hummingbird feeders out late in the summer, how many of you have seen these chubby hummingbirds? I mean, they just pork out. It's hilarious. I thought I had good pictures of one like that, and it's probably on my old computer, so I couldn't find it. But they'll come to the feeder constantly, or your flowers that are still blooming, because they need that energy in order to make that trip safely. It's just remarkable. The longest distance of any migrating bird is the Arctic tern, which is not something that we normally see here. But a colleague of mine, when I was still teaching, did see one at Goose Island in the fall traveling. They travel from basically the North Pole to the South Pole, which is, I think I wrote down what that distance is, 55,000 miles one way. 55,000 miles, you know, and it's just, it boggles the mind. Our shorebirds and a lot of our waterfowl, they won't travel. They're more of our short-term or short-distance migrants. They'll go to the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast, maybe dip into Mexico, but it's very common when I'm out birding down along the Gulf Coast in the winter to see killdeer and dunlin and the sandpipers and sanderlings and stuff like that. Loons, we always see loons, a lot of the different ducks that we're used to seeing. They'll go there. The neotropical birds, and it depends on which one. And some of them we really don't know exactly where they go. But they will go to South America or the Caribbean islands, Mexico, places like that. Are people here familiar with Kirtland warblers? That's the most endangered of our warbler species. It's making a bit of a comeback right here in Wisconsin, in fact. But they still aren't quite sure exactly where they go in the winter. I think they've been able to put the little radio packs on some of them, and I think they've decided they go somewhere to the Bahamas, and then they return to the jack pine forests to do their nesting. And they're real specialists as far as where they want to nest. 15-year-old jack pine forests is what they seem to like. And well, one of my projects that I was helping with, it's not that secret, but there's an area in the Black River State Forest where they have been detected there in the past. And so they're trying to draw them in because you have catastrophic things happen and you don't want to lose all of that conservation effort. A good example of that would be the whooping cranes. The whooping cranes, they've been raising an eastern flock that migrates down to Florida and thereabouts. The ones that are wild would go down to Texas. With what's happened in our weather, there were a few years back, I think it was during Katrina, a lot of the eastern flock that they had worked so hard to get south and migrating on their own was killed, you know, in the hurricanes. So they try and establish alternative territories for these birds that they're trying to protect so that they aren't all going to one place where they're put at risk, which that's just the reality of our world today, unfortunately. Now, the interesting thing with migration is that we don't really know for sure how birds can do this, but there's been a lot of fascinating research done in recent years to get a better idea of what allows a bird that was born this year and isn't with its parents, because not all of them migrate together. The males will often travel first, the females lag along, and then the young'uns, if they are hanging around with their parents, they might follow them or follow another bunch of birds. But if not, they end up most of the time where they're intended to end up, which is really amazing when you think about it. There were some experiments done by some researchers where they took, I think it was yellow-rumped warblers. They took them, trapped them, you know, mist-netted them or whatever, and then they drove basically clear across the country with them to an area where they weren't at all familiar with. And then they released them, which some of the research, you read this and you think, that seems really mean. But they had little radio packs on the birds, and they ended up where they were supposed to be. Somehow they figured out how to get where they're intended to be. Now, one of the things that they do know now about birds and how they can do these things is that it's like a built-in GPS, magnetic GPS. Somehow they can follow the magnetic force fields in the Earth that, and it's like a built-in map. Interestingly, I was reading some more about this. There's a part, we have this part in our brain too. It's called the hippocampus. And if I've got any neurologists in here, please correct me. In humans, it's located deep in the temporal lobe above our ears. And it's something that is supposed to help us with spatial memory and orienting. And one thing that I found intriguing as I was reading about this, I'm looking at you, Mr. Calvetti. People who rely a lot on electronic GPS, their hippocampus will shrink a bit because it's not doing the job it was intended to do. So if we're going to Rochester, you don't need to turn it on right away. We know how to get on I-90. But I thought that's kind of fascinating and kind of scary when you think about it. The joke that we have about navigating, we like to geocache. I know at least one person in here knows what that is. And our preferred we'll go get anything, but our preferred type is to be out in the woods, somewhere we've never been before, and hike for a long time and then find this box in the woods and sign it. It's a silly hobby, but we enjoy it. And I don't even carry my GPS most of the time anymore because he always finds the stuff anyway. But he'll be watching his tracks on his GPS, and you know, you can get disoriented when you're following those little lines. And more than once, you will attest to this. He wasn't sure which way to go. I heard a bird singing, and I knew what the bird was. And I heard it again, and I said, we need to go that way because I hear that, you know, whatever bird it is, singing. Am I right? Yeah, he's well trained. So there's magnetic fields that they follow. That hippocampus that we have, two little parts deep in our temporal lobe, in a bird, it's a big mat, basically, like a mushroom cap on the top of their brain. So when you think about the relative size compared to how big the brains are, it's a huge part of a bird's brain. They know that they use stars to navigate. They probably use certain landmarks, just like, our ancestors did or the river pilots did. Somehow they have a mental map built in there that probably improves with each migration every year, gets more definition. Another thing that I found interesting is they think that there's an odor sensing, that they know there's an odor sensing mechanism in a bird's brain. And they think that that helps them as well. And I suppose that makes sense if you think about, if you're very, very, like you think about your dogs, they smell everything that we can't smell. And it might be the same for birds. They know that if they get to this big wetland area, it's going to give off a certain aroma, and that's where they need to travel through. There isn't a lot of research in that area yet, but it's been starting. Much of the research done to figure out these things was with homing pigeons, because they're captive. They know already that these birds know how to find their way from one place to another. And so they would do all these interesting things. I will recommend, and they probably have it here as well, this book called The Genius of Birds. The author is Jennifer Ackerman, and she's really good at taking the scientific information that all the science wonks have and writing it in such a way that we can understand it. And she covers quite a bit about how birds navigate and some of the experiments that they do. So that's one that I would recommend if you're really interested in that. She covers a lot of other stuff in there too, but she has a really good section on how birds navigate. These are just some greater white-fronted geese that sometimes, I guess, people call them speckle bellies, and you can kind of see why. There's your great gray owl. That is North America's largest owl. They breed in northern Minnesota and further north. I think there have been breeding records in Bayfield County as well, but don't quote me on that. This one was near Boston a few years, well, let me think. It was the year I broke my arm, 2013. And I mentioned that sometimes the owls coming down in the winter cause problems. And this was kind of an example of it. I had slipped on ice and broke my arm the day, either right before or right after, I got a really nice zoom camera lens, which weighs probably 5 pounds. And so I couldn't manage the camera lens yet. We had been snowshoeing over in Buckhorn State Park. I had a cane, I did fine, it was flat. And I knew that this bird was there, people were reporting it. And so we went there, we took, a funny way home, and it was sitting there. And I had my camera set up on my tripod, but I just I'm so right-handed. It was my right arm that I had broken. I just couldn't manage it. And my husband had my small handheld camera, and he was watching too. And there were some photographers that felt that it was their right to walk out into the farmer's field. We were on the roadside, which this is the problem that happens. We were on the roadside, but these photographers were going into the field to get a better look. They had lenses like twice as long as mine, and they startled the bird, and it literally, didn't it fly like practically right over your head? I mean, this bird with a wingspan like this flies just over his head and lands on this stuff, and he managed to get this picture for me. So thank you, because I was having no luck. But they're amazing birds to see. I first saw them when they erupted. That's what they call the winter migrations of these birds that come from the far north. They call it an eruption. And they were all over northern Minnesota. And my mother and aunt and I went out looking. And my aunt had spotted one at the side of the road. This was in Aiken County. And you got this tall black spruce, and you know how skinny those are as trees. They aren't big, wide like our Christmas trees. They're kind of straight up with a little thing. And this huge bird lands and sits on the very top of that thing, and you'd expect it to tip over, but it didn't. And then we watched it, zeroes in on something under the snow, and it dove headfirst into it. And I have a whole sequence of pictures of that. And then it kind of came up, and we saw it kind of moving around. It was about halfway up to its wings were out like this on top of the snow. Well, it was killing the vole that it had caught, making sure it was dead. And then it flew up into the tree, gulped it down. It's fun to see, but it can create problems. It's like every time somebody reports an owl, the old, and I guess I have to be old, old birders say, oh, here we go again. People want to know exactly where it is so they can see it. And the bird lists say, just list the county or talk about it later so that it doesn't get pushed. What do we have next? This is one of the snowy owls that was up by the airport that year. I've seen them at the airport other years. This is just across on, what's the road? On the east side, like if you're going to go out to Fisherman's Road. That's that, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, DeBouch Trucking Company. That's their sign. And I was able to pull up in the car on the roadside and point my lens out the window. I have never gotten a picture of a snowy that I really like, but sometimes you take what you get. This is one of my favorites. That's a northern saw-whet owl. It is the smallest North American owl. They're like this big. They're just teeny, and they're so cute. We had gone to a banding station a couple years before up near Stevens Point, where they were mist netting them and banding them. And this is sort of dumb, but if you made a donation, you could hold one and they'd take your picture, and I had to do it. But so this was in late winter, early spring, and this is up in the Matthew Quarry area. We had some geocaches we had to take care of. And so he's off, checking on the geocaches. And I heard chickadees just going absolutely crazy off to the side. And I said, you go do your thing. I'm going to see what this is about. And it was at a part of the quarry where literally it's like a real narrow path and then straight down towards Smith Valley and thereabouts. And I see these chickadees, and I see something kind of looked like fluff. I thought it was maybe just like an old nest or something. And I'm looking for a safe way to get down there. There's still snow, there's still ice, all that kind of thing. And I'm looking, and what I like to do is look at the ground, because you might see owl pellets. Guys know what those are. They spit them up and there's bones. They're kind of cool. Or whitewash, which is owl poop. And I saw some on the ground, and it looked like it had just been dropped. And I look up, and there he is, just looking at me like that. And I didn't even have my big camera. I just had the regular camera lens. And I'm taking these pictures of this thing. It's just, and Native Americans would call them something along the lines of stupid bird, them and the boreal owls, because they aren't real afraid of people. You know, they'll just kind of hunker down, and he's fairly relaxed. You can see that he's not, when a bird starts to lengthen, an owl lengthens out and push, if they have the feathered horns, they try and make themselves look like part of the tree. You're too close, back off. He's just kind of half opening his eyes to see what I am, and I'm not a hawk, so I guess I'm okay. That was so cool. It was so cool. And he's walking back after he takes care of things. Where are you? And I'm like, I'm looking at a saw-whet owl. Where? And he did manage to follow my tracks down and get a look at it too. It was so cool. And then I called up Dan Jackson. People know who Dan is. He's kind of the acknowledged birding expert, but he retired recently, so that's probably why they got me. But I called him up and I said, I can kind of give you GPS coordinates where it is. He ended up not going, and it's like, okay, I tried. Which picture I got next? Some of the birds that we get here in the winter, I don't know if you'd call them migrants exactly. This is a Townsend solitaire. It's a member of the thrush family. It's normally a mountain bird, and they're pretty regular at Devil's Lake State Park this time of year. When I was still working, I had a schedule where I had one day off every 6 days. And about this time of year, one of my day sixes, I would go down to Devil's Lake and hike up, you know, the tumbled rocks thing to look for these guys. This one was actually up in Hickson in the Bluffs a few years back. For whatever reason, maybe it's just too harsh in the mountains. The other one that shows up here in the winter, that's normally a western mountain bird, is golden eagles. And a lot of times people think they're seeing a golden eagle, and it's usually a juvenile bald eagle. There are some pretty good field marks to tell the difference, but you know, you see them and you think, cool. They tend to hang out in the bluffs because it's more like what they're used to in the mountains. And in January every year, they do hold a golden eagle count through the Eagle Center up in Wabasha. I've never been able to take part in that. Maybe this year I will, or maybe I won't. Maybe we'll be gone by then, but which is usually why that happens. They don't completely understand why birds migrate when they do. Obviously, it's a matter of food. If they don't have the food sources they need, or they're becoming less abundant, time to move. They think that it's probably related to the length of daylight. Something in their bodies tells them, oh, the days are getting shorter, I need to start moving. And so that's what they'll do. There's a myth that's out there that if you leave a hummingbird feeder out, they won't migrate. That is not true. Go ahead and leave your hummingbird feeder out if you want, because they need the energy. You know, if you've got ones coming from further north, they'll stop over and they'll get something to eat to build up their energy for that flight across the Gulf. But the other cool thing that can happen is you get birds that for some reason are blown off course. And you'll get things, most commonly they're rufous hummingbirds, which they're actually pretty hardy for a hummingbird. They're like British Columbia and Pacific Northwest. Somehow there'll be a few that end up here. And a friend of mine, Laura Erickson, in Duluth, Minnesota, had a rufous hummingbird show up at her house, and it was like late November. She actually bought a specialized hummingbird feeder that had like some kind of heating element or something in it to keep the syrup from freezing. And this was in 2021. It finally left on December 4th in Duluth, Minnesota. So because she had a feeder out. So go ahead and leave that feeder out. I remember one time I was bringing my feeder in to clean it or maybe just put it away for the winter. It was late in the season. And it had hung on a clothes pole in our backyard. And the kids saw me. I'm holding it at the back door. And we saw Hummingbird come over to where the feeder usually hung. And it darts around a little bit. And like, where'd it go? And it spotted me. And I was holding it, standing on the back step. And it came over and helped itself to some of that. So it's not because you leave your bird feeders out that they don't move. Most birds migrate at night. If you go out on a quiet, clear night, you can sometimes hear overhead little chip notes. They won't be singing, but you'll hear, I've been hearing killdeers at night. They do that probably partly because they navigate somewhat by the stars, and you need nighttime to see the stars, but also, especially for the smaller birds, there's less chance of predators. There's the owls, but most owls don't eat birds. They eat small mammals and stuff. So they'll migrate at night, and weather can affect their travels. Let me see if I'm not sure how far along this one is. Oh yeah, there's the hummingbird. Don't worry. Yeah, he's a little fat, but not there yet. That's a spot. Oh, this is something else. There is something I'll show you. It's further down in here called Birdcast. And it's a bird forecasting website. If you just Google Birdcast, you can find it. And they will have a map that shows areas lit up for bird movement at night. And it's the most popular in the spring and the fall. People want to see when the birds are moving through. And a couple weeks ago, when Helene was wreaking havoc over the southeast part of the country, you could see this big blob of bird movement, and it just stopped. They know they're not going to want to go there yet. Migration started out a little slow this year because we seem to have a lot of southeast and southwest winds, and they don't want to fly into the wind if they don't have to. In fact, in the spring, when the migration is going on, when you have a weather event that stops the birds, they'll all just drop where they are. They call that a fallout. And they'll be feeding very low right in front of you. They aren't going to waste energy if they don't have to. So they will stop and wait. There is kind of a sequence to when different groups of birds migrate. The shorebirds are the first to go. That would be like the killdeer and the dunlins and sanderlings and a whole bunch of little birds. They start in July, and they usually peak in mid-August. There's still yellowlegs and things like that moving through right now that I've seen reports of, but they've pretty much moved on to the Gulf Coast. The songbirds, like the indigo buntings and the warblers and the vireos and the flycatchers and things like that, they start moving in August, and they're mostly through the end of September. But it's been a little bit late this year because we had those southeast and southwest winds and then the hurricane. So some of those are still moving through. The last to go are the waterfowl. And that's why we get this spectacle every fall on the river, especially over by Brownsville. Pretty much the entire world's population of tundra swans stop here. And they'll stay here until the river freezes up. They're feeding on like water lily tubers and stuff like that. It's not fish so much, it's vegetables. And they'll hang out there until freeze up, and then they head off to Chesapeake Bay. And they'll come back in the spring, but it's not as concentrated as we see it in the fall. They want to stoke up, I guess. Those are big birds to have to make it that far. So they're, yes? They're probably just getting there. I haven't seen, the Fish and Wildlife people will have these weekend things where there's a ranger there. And I haven't seen any of those events posted quite yet. I usually don't go until like the end of October, beginning of November. Yes. Yep. Just two? Just two? Okay. They could have been they could have been trumpeters too. But yeah. I mean, they're starting to come through, but I would hold off a little bit longer. I mean, you'll get a few. And if you check the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Facebook pages for the Upper Mississippi River, they usually have kind of updates as to when they're peaking over there. I haven't gone over there yet. Like I said, for me, I usually wait till the end of October, beginning of November, because, and that's somewhat new. Like 20 years ago, when our younger son was maybe 10 or 11, they used to be up in Alma at Rikes Lake. There's a campground there along 35. That used to be the place to go. And Alma used to have banners with swans. But apparently that lake, the conditions have changed. There's probably not as many of the things that they like to eat, and so now they're down in Brownsville. And I noticed when I've been through Alma, they have eagles on their flags now, not swans. So they do change, but yeah, I think Brownsville's definitely the place. One thing to keep in mind, besides leaving your hummingbird feeders out to give them something to eat, is because birds migrate at night, lights can really mess them up. Tall buildings in cities will engage in something called lights out because the birds get confused. They're trying to follow these things. And I know there's a group in Madison right now. They patrol certain areas where there are tall buildings, and they gather up the birds that are window strikes that have died overnight. And a thing about window strikes, another thing about window strikes is people think that, oh, the bird hit the window, they fell down, but they flew off. Most of the time, they die. You don't see it, but they die from internal injuries. They shake it off for a minute and they die. So turning the lights off is one thing. Another thing, oh, here you can kind of go back. You can kind of see the difference between a spring and a fall bird. This is a yellow-rumped warbler. We call them butterbutts in the spring, all spiffy for the ladies. There. And you notice he's stoking up. So you'll see some bird field guides talk about confusing fall warblers. There will be a page in the Peterson's field guide. Confusing fall warblers. That's one of the things that I think birders enjoy, is it's sort of like a mystery hunt to see, can I correctly identify these confusing fall warblers or gulls, or no, forget gulls. Nobody likes gulls except Dan Jackson. And the sandpipers. They're very difficult to separate out, and there's like teeny little things that you can tell the difference. But another thing with the window strike, there's some of the swans. These ducks stayed in Boston. We went to Boston this spring. We had to see them. Okay, this is the birdcast map for last night and today. And you can see that white area right along the flyway, just kind of peeking into Arkansas and Tennessee. That's predicted bird movement overnight. And you can see that they're kind of not going to go down to the Gulf yet. They're aware of the weather down there. But the number of birds, I had that written down, the number of birds that are killed by window strikes per year, does anybody want to guess? It's 1 billion. And we already have declining bird populations for a lot of reasons. So something that can be done is to develop, there are products on the market that you can buy. This is a homemade version. I think it's just paracord. Yeah, have you noticed an improvement in? Part of it too is like in the winter where you have your bird feeders. If they're too close to windows, birds are going to bop into the window heading for the feeders. So you want it to be, I think the recommended distance is at least 6 to 8 feet from any windows. And that still should be plenty for you to be able to see them. There are these products you can buy. They're little decals that are like a series of dots. There's a lot of different things you can do. But if you have windows where you notice that birds are hitting it, this would really be a big help for them. You can provide natural, native plantings so that there is the food that these birds need. And even in the fall, we have a difference of opinion. I like to leave things messy because there's seed and cover for the birds in the winter. So we kind of compromise. We'll pull out some stuff and then I have my little areas where I can have my messy part. And I have a brush pile in the backyard, kind of out of the way where we put stuff that provides cover. Things like that are really helpful to let our birds survive and thrive. I think that was the last. Yeah, I mentioned the Audubon Society. I'm going to end with a story about an ill-advised migration. Turtle was watching the geese. The geese were all talking and kind of agitated and kind of gathering up in big groups. And it was late in the summer. And finally he went and said, "What is the deal here?" And they said, "Oh, we have to migrate." He says, "Migrate? What are you talking about?" "Well, we have to go south because everything's going to freeze up. We aren't going to be able to get anything to eat. And if we stick around here, that's the end of geese." And Turtle started thinking about that as he watched them getting ready. And he said, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to eat? Things are going to freeze. I need to migrate too." So he went up to some of the geese. He said, "Take me along." And the geese said, "Oh, come on. You don't have wings. You can't fly. How the heck do you think you can migrate?" "Well, here, I've got an idea." And he got a big sturdy stick. And he went up to two of the geese and he said, "You guys, you hold this stick and I'll clamp on with my strong jaws." And the geese said, "Well, okay, we'll give it a try." And so the day came when they were going to set off south. Turtle clamped on and boom. Oh, he was flying. Well, not really, but he was getting a bird's eye view of the marsh below and the river along the way and the bluffs. And this was wonderful. And he wanted to tell them how grateful he was, but he realized he had to clamp on. So he would just go, "I am happy." And geese would kind of look at him and shake their heads, and on they went. At night, they would come down and take a breather, and then it would continue the next day. After about 5 days, Turtle couldn't take it anymore. He was in new territory that he had never seen before, and it was spectacular. There was a wide river that was wider than any he had seen, and things had flattened out along the floodplain. He just couldn't believe it. And as they were flying, he said, down he went, landed right on a rock, cracked his shell, and slithered into the mud in humiliation, and didn't come out until the weather warmed up in the spring. And that is why a number of Native American tribes say turtle has those broken spots on the back of his shell. So my advice is, if you're going to migrate, don't try and fly unless you have a private pilot's license. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm open to that. Yes?
Can you speak briefly on bolting and robins, why we don't see them in the August, et cetera?
That's a good point. You know, and my husband had raised that comment too. He said, I haven't seen any robins for a while. Well, late in the summer, in order to get, and if you go back to the picture I had of the two fall and spring Audubon's warbler, yellow butterbutt, they will molt most of their feathers, including their flight feathers, and grow new ones so they have new strong ones for the migration. Well, if you don't have flight feathers, you aren't going to fly very well. So they kind of go off into places like the cover that hopefully you've provided for them with brush piles or native plantings or whatever, and just hang out until they get their flight feathers back. And all birds go through that. That's a good point. Thank you. Okay, a copian? I-A-N. Okay. Like where I got the instructions. Okay, yeah, and you know, when I was looking for a picture to illustrate this, I think I just put in window bird strike protection or something like, you know, I just put in a Google term and went to different ones. And there are a lot of different companies. There was a big controversy when they built the new Vikings stadium because it's a bird killer. And the groups up there were really lobbying them to put in a different kind of glass. They have since installed some kind of protection. I don't know what the birding people did to get the Vikings to do that, but I'm glad they did. Because any building like that with no, you know, that's just, you can do it in such a way that it really doesn't impede the look of the glass. You know, this one does, but there are other ways that are more aesthetic, I guess would be the term. Yes.
We've noticed for the last few days, huge groups of geese flying north, but are they just kind of in the neighborhood?
Probably, you know, and I mean, you know, they'll show up in fields or out in the marsh and feeding up. They're probably looking for someplace good where there's, you know, recently cut fields or whatever. But yeah, it does. It's funny when you see them like, are you supposed to be going that way? The closest big one I can think of would be in the Sandhill Wildlife Area up near Babcock. But I haven't gone that direction lately, but up until right before we went to Iceland, the beginning of September, the middle of September, over on Highway 16, just east of West Salem, past the campground a little bit, you would see 40, 50 of them in the evenings in the fields there. And I was always, oh, I'm going to go over there. You know, it's like, what, 5 miles at most from where we live? It's not far at all. And I'd say, but I want to go to get the perfect light and all, and it never came. And, you know, I should just gone and taken pictures. Uh-huh. I've seen them like that in Adams County, near the, it's a wildlife area where you go looking for owls and greater prairie chickens and stuff like that. Buena Vista grasslands. Anything else? Yeah, sandhill cranes. A gathering area near here. The closest reliable one I know of is up by Babcock at the Sandhill Wildlife Area. They come in the evening. But I was seeing big bunches of them on Highway 16 just east of West Salem. You'll see them gather like that. Yes.
I thought bluebirds, but the last 2 winters, we have a heated bird bath.
Mm-hmm.
We get large groups of them. We only see it in the summer. We see them a lot in winter.
I have encountered that too, like out on Seven Bridges Road in the Van Loon Wildlife Area. I'd go out there hiking in the winter and there'd be bluebirds. And, there's some open water and a lot of those thrushes, they're hardy. They'll stick around if there's a water source and they'll eat berries. And so I.
If you want to go see the tundra sloths down by Brownsville, the Park and Rec Department for La Crosse has a bus trip. that
Oh,
goes
okay.
down there.
That's good to know. Did everybody hear that? The Park and Rec Department for La Crosse does sponsor bus trips down to the Brownsville Overlook if you're not able to drive down there. If you are able to drive down there, I would say avoid the weekends because you get a lot of people and they have, I'm not saying you should not be enjoying people, but you'll have better places to look. It gets pretty crowded on the weekends there. And we're all retired, so we can go anytime we want. Okay, well, thank you.